Hi, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined by my friends Jonathan Pageau and Jason M. Baxter. First, Jonathan is a renowned icon carver and symbolic thinker, creator of the Symbolic World YouTube channel, published in press, and more. His work explores the intersection of Christian faith, culture, and the deeper meaning behind the patterns we see in the world around us. Jason is a speaker, author, and a college professor. He writes on the relevance of medieval beauty, especially as it relates to Dante and C.S. Lewis. Jason's also the director for the Center for Beauty and Culture at Benedictine College in Kansas, in the heart of the USA. In his popular writing and lectures, he ventures into the arts, travel and literature, technology and humanism, science, culture, and the experience of modernity, all in light of the ancient and medieval world. So, first of all, I suppose, what do you know and appreciate about one another's works, and maybe what interested you in having this conversation? If I start with you, Jonathan.
Well, we're really interested in Dante over the Symbolic World in general. We just put together a class with Richard Rowland on Inferno. We just did Purgatory. And I also met with Jason. Was it, I don't even know, 2 weeks ago? Is it 2 weeks? I guess it's two
Weeks
weeks ago.
ago. Yeah.
And we sat in Notre Dame and had drinks and had a great discussion. And so it really piqued my interest about just how close the people that he cares about, Dante, Lewis, all of these thinkers and how they connect so closely to to my project and to the project of the people that are around me. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Tremendous. And yourself, Jason?
Yeah, Jonathan's one of a set of people that I admire that I wonder if our mechanistic modern paradigm is beginning to crumble, if there are beginning to be cracks in it. Because I think of people like Jonathan, think of people like Paul Kingsnorth, Rod Dreher's new book on wonder. In the UK, there's Sebastian Morello. Lots of people sort of writing on this, not just the legacy of the Enlightenment and the kind of blinders that it's put upon us. C.S. Lewis called it that we live in the age of evil enchantment, and that we need the strongest possible spells to wake us from it. And so I'm just wondering, with Kingsnorth and with Jonathan's work and with Sebastian's work and Dreher's work and many others, Marcus's podcast, that these things that I have loved as a scholar and done my best as to sort of to do these kind of archaeological reconstructions of them, right? Not just what do they say, but what did it feel like for the original audience to read? All of a sudden, to my delight and surprise, what I do is is not irrelevant, but is sort of at this sort of part of this new movement to actually sort of rethink the spiritual world in which we live. And I think that people like Jonathan are really brave and really creative and have achieved this following because people are tired of living in a world which is not spiritually porous, as Charles Taylor put it.
Hmm. Excellent. Thanks, Jason. And I want to touch upon that shared interest and love for Dante. So you have translated recently the Inferno and you've written this introductory book to the Divine Comedy, Jason. So what do you hope readers will take away from the new translation, and maybe why is it significant to you, building upon what you've just described?
Yeah, that's exactly the question that people keep asking me. Why did we need the 29th new translation of Dante's Inferno? I'm going to do the others too. I'm going to do Purgatorio. I'm going to do Paradiso. But I think what began for me as kind of a personal project became a learning experience in the middle of it. What I wanted to do is I wanted to establish a kind of relationship with the master that he himself had with Virgil, right? This kind of strange apprenticeship that can happen over the stretch of a millennium. And so I thought, look, I mean, the only way to do this is to go word by word, right? Because when you're a scholar, when you're a teacher, when you're a writer, there's so much in Dante. You can just say what you want to say, right? You can always skip, the canto of moon spots in Paradiso too, if it's just too difficult. I bet Jonathan doesn't. He deals with the moon spots, right? The symbolic world of the moon spots, right? But most of us would skip, the boring stuff and just say the stuff that gets us excited. And I thought, you know what? I've got to the stage of my relationship with Dante. I want to be made to know the whole thing. I'm going to translate it word for word. But and so my goal was I kept having this metaphor of being a kid and learning a piano piece, right? Of course, at first you're just sort of looking at the keys, trying to translate them into your fingers. But eventually, when you get to know it well enough, you close the book, you throw the book away, you close your eyes, and you play it. And the experience of doing that is different. It's more embodied. It's in the nerves, it's in the pulses, it's in the veins, right? It's in the arms. It's not in the brain, right? It's in the heart. So I wanted to see if I could do something like that with the relationship to Dante. That's kind of a personal project, right? But while I was doing it, I kept coming across all these things which I thought hadn't been represented as well as I would like in other translations. For example, when Dante was a young man, he was writing a little treatise called On Vernacular Eloquence, which I always jokingly with my students call Dante's diary, right? Because it's as if we caught him in the middle of one of his notebooks before he wrote his poem. He was trying to write the perfect poem, which I put in all caps, right? He never actually wrote it, but he was in pursuit of writing a poem which he thought would almost be like a reliquary for Beatrice's beauty, right? Just as a sort of like, a medieval relic would be inside one of these, what we almost consider sort of gaudy, sacred reliquaries now. And Dante seemingly wanted to write a poem which would represent that eternal beauty of Beatrice. And so he starts to write himself this little handbook on how to do it, as well as kind of thinking through his own tragedies of his life and how it might have actually put him in a position to do it well. So he makes all these rules for himself, right? He says it has to be slow and spacious, and it has to have this elevated lexicon. You can only use words like amore, desio, virtute, securtate, right? There's these kind of funny, almost kind of stereotypical dramatic Italian words. But then when he started to write the Inferno, he violates almost every single one of those rules that he had written for himself for how to write the perfect poem. The thing is fast. It's what rhetoricians would call paratactic. It doesn't have those sort of gliding, spacious Dickens-like sentences, but has that kind of pop, 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 pop Hemingway sort of aspect. It moves fast. It almost feels noir. He does use sometimes those lofty, what I jokingly call $10 words. But he mixes them in with low words, with earthy words, with sharp, angry, broken words. He creates a poetic fabric which is completely different than what you would have expected. And this got me so interested that it kind of became, it's kind of exciting. It's sort of my discovery. It's like the translation found me as opposed to the other way around. And I thought this had to be represented because it felt to me like Dante was going in two directions at the same time. On the one hand, he was trying to do something classical and weighty with gravitas, Virgilian, Ovidian, Horatian, right? All Boethian, all anchored in the classical past. But on the other hand, he was trying to do something which was contemporary and modern, maybe Franciscan even. And it was fast and it was in the veins and in the pulses. So I wanted to try to create a translation which caught that kind of dramatic rhythm, which at points was just barreling forward with all kinds of speed, almost like a noir film. But at other points, felt like it was slowing down and had become spacious, as if the eternal music, right? Think of how every canticle ends with reference to the stars, as if those stars were trying to reassert their music from the background into the foreground, kind of like Jonathan's work, right? The symbolic consciousness manifesting itself on the surface. I wanted to do a poem which captured that in an embodied and visceral way. And so, like I said, I began doing something which was for me fun, a hobby. It was a personal project. But I feel that in the middle of it, I discovered sort of a rhythmical Boethian, Pythagorean aspect, which also has certain Franciscan dimensions of humility and embodiment, which we could talk about more later on. And I wanted to put all those things together because I think Dante, well, we know what Dante thought about his poem. He thought it was pretty good. But the reason why he thought it was pretty good is because he brought together these two poetic poles, what you could say the modern and the vernacular, and the ancient and the rhetorical, what he calls this gliding prolixitas. And he threw them together and created a poetic fabric which had never been felt before. I wanted to try to capture that to the extent that I could.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing, Jason. And with that all said, Jonathan, do you have any particularly burning questions for Jason about the work his translations are
Yeah,
saying?
I mean, I'm curious to see because my impression, although I'm not I don't know the Italian aspect of the poem, but my impression in reading the Inferno, I read it a few months ago again, uh, was that there was also something about the very subject of the poem, which creates space for that type of use, like the idea of using kind of dirty words and like almost like bathroom humor. There's
Yeah,
this,
some of that.
you get you and it there's a kind of there's a kind of scatological element to the Inferno, especially when the demons are speaking, and that would make sense that then it would also have that tone in terms of a kind of rapid paced and not in this kind of lofty, spacious. And I'm curious if that changes, right, in the poem. That is, as you move towards paradise, does Dante use more of the,
Mm.
does Paradise look more like the poem that he talked about in his diary or in his book on eloquence?
Oh man, that's a whole wonderful set of questions. So I'll reveal to your listeners, Marcus, our listeners, what has been on my bedside table. While I was reading, while I was translating the Inferno, I was also reading William Wordsworth's Prelude, in part because his sort of the smoothness of his music. I wanted to get at least that music into it, even if I was using these sort of staccato moments that Jonathan sort of talked about of radically lowering the register. But I think so if Inferno feels like a strange mixture of music, but also of anger, if it has some sort of, Janacek, or I guess if you want heavy metal, Russian
Yeah,
circles
yeah,
kind
that's
of.
why heavy metal people embrace the aesthetic of the Inferno, like just
Yeah.
in
Okay. So
everything
Russian
they do.
circle, we're among friends here, right? Russian circles, gnosis kind of vibes. I actually will admit I did listen to a little bit of that while translating certain, passages among the fraudulent, right? I think that those are the best. You'll see. I think that for me, Purgatorio, and this is something I'm doing right now. I'm in the middle of the project and it's coming out next year. But the sort of tentative working hypothesis is Purgatorio feels like bread and butter, right? Or if you want to go full on Chestertonian, bread and beer.
Yeah.
It's the elements of life. It's simple, it's humble, right? In some sense, the humiliation of hell becomes the humility of purgatory, right? It goes from desecration of the body and hopelessness and brokenness and fragmentation to a rootedness, to an embodiment, to an earthiness. And I have to say, I have an English model for that, and I've been reading a bunch of Wendell Berry poetry, right? The Wendell Berry poetry, so earthy and embodied, right? Sit down. How to be a poet. Sit down. Be still. Look around you. Breathe the unconditioned air, unconditionally, this sort of thing, right? And I think Dante has some of those types of those kinds of vibes, that kind of humility, the weightedness of the real, right? The sense of touch when you hug the neighbor that you've shunned your whole life, right? This is being reintegrated into the earth and reintegrated into communities, right? And I love that aspect. So I think the humiliation of hell becomes the humility of purgatory. But you still find some of those little words, even if now they're being recontextualized, and they're not angry and broken and sad and fragmented and sharp, but they're small and they're willing to bear the load and they're willing to wait and they're willing to be patient. For me, Paradiso, and again, this is a working hypothesis, but I always tell my students the best introduction you can get to Paradiso is to go listen to Thomas Tallis's Spem and Oleum, the 40-part motet, at which some points there are 40 separate melodic lines. And it's so complicated, it feels like waves of human voices. It's just too much to take in, right? It's as close as the human mind can get to trying to process infinity, but also failing. Well, I always tell my students, Paradiso is a million-part motet, or depending on how many make it. David Bentley Hart's right. It'll be even bigger, a trillion-part motet, right? But at least it's sort of, million-part motet or billion-part motet of all these voices. Because they've been reintegrated into human community and with the world and with the earth again, now they're given the privilege of having their own melodic lines and they make sense. So for me, the Paradiso becomes this massively complex polyfugal, um, Baroque kind of thing, which you might best sort of capture with the linguistic density of Hopkins. So if one is the heavy metal of Russian circles, and then Purgatorio is the sweet, string quartet that your wife puts on at the dinner party, right? Then Paradiso goes full on Baroque and with counterpoint and fugue and creates that wonderfully difficult linguistic fabric like you might find in a Hopkins poem. Those are my working hypotheses for the other two.
But you're not there yet. You'll get there. Are you going to put one out a year? Is that your hope, or is it longer than that?
Purgatorio's coming out next year. I'm excited about that. It's in progress and it's going to be in use by some audiences in the U.S. and I'm excited about that. And then Paradiso, we'll see. Hopefully, it will stay on a 1-year track. But with Paradiso, I'll just I don't know. I might have to go out into the desert, like of Utah or something like that for 9 months and to cleanse my linguistic palate and come back and be able to say it properly.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
You might see Paul Kingsnorth out there.
Yeah, you might see Paul out there.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah, sounds good. Well, he'll help me. Yeah, maybe he'll co-author it for me.
Yeah, he'll make up a whole language, and watch out for that. You know,
That's right. Then yeah, then we'll have to get Tolkien on that one, right?
that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think to create that dense fabric of words, like Dante just keeps using these puns. And I mean, it seems as if it's almost kaleidoscopic. I guess you could put it this way. Seemingly, Dante is actually in Ravenna at points in which he's writing Paradiso. That in some sense, his individual words now sparkle. All the $10 words come back now, but they come back in this huge collision of energy. And all these little words now sparkle. And Dante creates this ultra dense linguistic fabric. So let's gonna try to create that. And I think I'll have to read Hopkins and maybe even modernist poets to get it.
Hmm. Interesting.
beautiful. I want to kind of tie it a little bit to your recent work, Jonathan, if we may. So, one way I thought I might frame this is in the work of the Christian philosopher Linda Zagzebski. She focuses on the importance of models in great literature for us to emulate in order to live a good life. And Vegan Groyan likewise talks about the moral imagination and also looks at how that's communicated in traditional stories. I wonder if you might describe the importance of great literature like the Divine Comedy and so on, and like the fairy tales that you're retrieving and helping us to form our moral imagination. I suppose, especially in contrast to an overcooked, I would say, hermeneutic of suspicion as it's kind of embodied in modern storytelling. You see this in The Boys and things like that, where every hero is torn down. I think you've mentioned before that there's this transgression for transgression's sake, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I see this. This is what's happening right now. Is there is a with understandably, after World War II, there was a shift towards suspicion of identity in general and suspicion of all things that we celebrate because we realize that they can lead, obviously, to horrible things. Um, and so we're at this moment where, the post World War II narrative is kind of crumbling in many ways. The World War II myth is crumbling, but also the reaction to it is crumbling. And so we're not sure. That's why a lot of people are feeling in this state of meaninglessness or wandering. They don't know where to look. And so what I see is that there's a new enchantment coming. That doesn't mean that it's good. It just means that there will be a need for a new foundation myth at some point, a relative one. Maybe not like I don't know how big it has to be in order to refound the future. And so I think that the best thing to do at this point is to focus on the right stories or focus on the full stories, because the fairy tales or the ancient stories, the ones that are remembered until today, the great epics, they have a kind of balance in them that avoids the excesses of ideology, right? You can read the Iliad from the point of view of the two sides, and it's a completely coherent reading. And I think it's the same actually for Bible stories and even gospel stories. We don't tend to do it because people don't think that way, but you can actually read most of the Bible stories from the point of view of the different characters. You can read the Bible, you can read Exodus from the point of view of the Pharaoh. It's actually a pretty coherent reading. It's actually not completely ridiculous. And I think that's what you find in the great stories and fairy tales. And I think in Dante, Dante in particular, because he takes us from the very, the very point of this kind of frozenness, incapacity to move, and this ascent. It's the ultimate hero's journey in his story. It kind of has all of reality encapsulated into it. So I think that the idea of bringing back these stories and in a celebratory way, because people do bring them back, but they bring them back with a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion that you mentioned. So the fairy tales are there on our horizon, a cultural horizon, but now it's all deconstruction. Um, and you see that also, like, for example, in Dante, it seems like the readings that have interested people now in the past few generations have been personal readings, political readings. Not that those aren't there, they are there. But the lofty aspect of it, right? The reason why nobody reads Paradiso and everybody reads Inferno is because the reading of Paradiso is actually the one that we kind of need now. We need to be moving towards that capacity to celebrate all that is good and all that is virtuous, in order to refound whatever we need to refound on the right foundation stone. So that's why I'm excited to see a lot of people people like Martin Shaw. You mentioned a few people that are bringing back these old stories, and people are paying attention and are excited by them. I think it's the time for that right now.
Yeah, even like Wes Anderson's sort of latest Netflix series, right? He sort of gets beyond the illusion of television and has storytellers sitting in chairs telling stories with, kind of really clunky sets. But it seems like even the sort of the aesthetic of story and its simplicity
because there are all these things
all
happening at the
things are new
same
again.
time. You see it all because the spectacle of Hollywood is collapsing. We're just bored. Like, it's just watching a $250 million CGI movie is boring. You're like, you just see these things moving in front of me. It's like, I don't,
Mm.
and so what do you do? Like, what do you do once you've reached the end of the carnival? Like, once you've basically,
Mm.
once you've just completely gorged yourself on cake, there's only one way to go. And I think that it's true, and it's like all these things are collaborating together towards that return to more celebratory and participative storytelling.
Yeah. Well, what we want to hear about is fear and failure and sin and love and hope and sacrifice and God and goodness and light and darkness, right? That's no more motorcycle chases, please.
Yeah, well, you can see it, like it's happening on all these levels at the same time. So, and you can see that the old world is still not noticing. Like, even in the digital world, the success of someone like Joe Rogan, it's like he just sits there and talks to someone for 3 hours, and he is more popular than anything else that exists on the media landscape. And the
Mm.
people that have these highly edited, like, highly produced, they don't understand what's going on, what is happening, why would anybody want to just sit there and watch two people talking for 3 hours? This is ridiculous. But I think that it marks a shift. Obviously that shift has to be brought back. Like, you also have to get into these conversations. Watching them is not enough. Like, we have to get involved. And the thing about traditional stories, something like Dante or the fairy tales or the gospel stories and also the great myths, is that because they're related to our identity, they're not fictional. Dante's story is not fictional in the way that a Marvel story is fictional. It's talking about things that everybody thought was real, and therefore it can be celebratory in a way that the Star Wars fan with his like lightsaber dressed as Obi-Wan is just a joke, is a parody of, and so all of these things are, I think, like I said, all these things are kind of collapsing and happening simultaneously.
And what do you think then, Jonathan, is the place of the printed word, like the lovely series that you're offering, and then oral storytelling? How might they sort of mutually enrich each other? And whenever a few weeks ago, whenever we spoke, we mentioned Martin Shaw speaking in front of the crowd at your conference and same in our conference in Dublin, and you could hear a pin drop, and people were just so engaged in that participation. Maybe why is that important? To your point, and maybe what are some ways we can embody those.
Well, I think that the printed word always has to be kind of secondary to the storytelling. I'm fine with the printed word, but it has to be secondary to the liturgical aspect of it. And that's why we're printing fairy tales, and like we're doing it on purpose. We're making fairy tales with beautifully bound fairy tales with beautiful illustration, almost like little treasure object, because the point of making a fairy tale is because your child can't read it on their own. You have to sit with your child with this beautiful object and then create a moment of communion. That's why, to me, publishing fairy tales is so important. We're not just doing this arbitrarily. This is a very much thought out, I wouldn't say strategy, but a very, very much thought out vision of how we can embody media back into our family life. And I'm not against making movies or TV shows. Like, I'm not against any of that, but it has to be anchored in participation first, and then all that stuff can be on top of it.
Terrific. Thanks, Jonathan. And Jason, I want to move the conversation, if we may, to a more broad kind of medieval conception or constitution approach that we might have to the cosmos. And how does that contrast with this more modern kind of Promethean and technocratic mindset and way of viewing reality? And maybe how might we come to appreciate the an ordered freedom versus the extremes of, as Jonathan I think talks about, individualism and commensurately then big government? I suppose considering that many of us are concerned primarily with safety and comfort, and how do we then maybe re-establish some of the media and institutions and restore old ones, maybe in line with what we're talking about with the storytelling, retrieving those traditions. And
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as, an XY axis, and that our mentality, our in a world of datafication of the self, right? As Deborah Lupton calls it, or the data soul. We think of that we're trying to produce as many work units as possible over against time units. And we sort of, we count our steps, we monitor our sleep, right? We've like hooked ourselves up to all these machines in order to see what kind of productivity we can do. And the goal, of course, is not just linear velocity, but the goal is actually acceleration, right? And so for us, in some sense, I think you could say this is getting kind of Pageauian here, right? For us, the fundamental geometrical shape in our world is the parabola, right? It's the exponential function. That's what feels to us as important. That's the trending, right? That's the significant. Um, I think in the pre-modern world, the most important symbol, of course, is the circle. Now, the circle is the ancients say all kinds of crazy things about this, which is at first is difficult to wrap your mind around. But what they say is that the circle is the most perfect shape. And what they mean is that if you were going around fast enough on a circle, it would be almost as if you were standing still. And thus, this is a strange symbol, but the whole point of the symbol is that the goal of art, the goal of literature, but also the goal of the good life is to create a sense of spaciousness, right? As Vodalaskin puts it and Laurus, to spatialize the temporal, to make the eternal present in the midst of the flow of time, to get time to slow down and curl back so that it pools up. And I think when Jonathan talks about the fairy tale and reading it to your kids, preferably by a live fire, right? This is what's happening. We're stopping the flow of time for a brief moment. And that's why it feels significant. It feels like, a Kairos moment, right? And our for us is a sort of strange experience. Our ancient ancestors would not have been surprised. They would have said, of course, that's why I told you the circle was the most the most perfect geometrical symbol. So I think what we said earlier about why does Dante use this angry, sharp, Russian circles kind of style? Part of it is because he thinks that his world has just sort of become unhinged morally, and that the level of fraudulence had grown to such a level that the world was just about to become unglued. In other words, Dante seemingly thought that people in his age couldn't hear the circles anymore, the great circles of the cosmos, the great circles of the turning wheels. And in Dante's imagination, they're not just these great sort of moving circles, but they're spaced out according to the same harmonic intervals of the Pythagorean lute. The world is playing, an attractive and lovely music, right? The world is giving us more benevolence and abundance than we deserve or could handle. But in Dante's day, and I certainly think he would recognize our time, he thought that people had become deaf to it. And so he had to use this angry rhetoric with these sharp, angry words to wake people up and thus create a space, maybe melt people down so that they could be reformed according to these sort of great patterns. And so when Jonathan said earlier that Dante is this great hero story, right? We have Gilgamesh going to the underworld. Odysseus does it. Aeneas does it. Any man who's worth his manhood goes to the underworld, right? In the pre-modern world. But I think the exciting thing about Dante's Inferno is that he has a little trick. In the Aeneid, Aeneas goes all the way up to the gates of Dis, and the Sibyl, his guide, the prophetess, says, "You can't go in there. It's just too evil." She describes for him what he would see, and then they turn back and go to the Elysian fields to find Anchises the father, right? Well, in a similar way, in Inferno 9, Virgil and Dante come right up to those same gates, right? The gates of Dis. And Virgil tries to open them, but surprise, surprise, cannot. It's just like in the Aeneid. And then an angelic force has to come and comes like a hurricane, which Dante describes in what Auerbach says was this new sublime poetry, something that had never been quite done before, at least not since deep antiquity. He opens up the gates. So the Christian poet has to go all the way down. It is a heroic journey, but it's not just overcoming monsters and it's not just overcoming obstacles. It's the more difficult and painful thing, which I think we're all really afraid of. It's going to the depths of my own heart and realizing what's in there. And the Christian poet has to go all the way down to the depths. And then Dante symbolizes that, of course, in those great circles that go all the way down to the center of hell. Now, what's even more beautiful is when you get to the center of hell, then he climbs back out, and now he's in Antarctica, and that's where the mountain of purgatory is, and he keeps climbing that. So for Dante, in this lovely sort of symbolism, right, these lovely sort of circles of motion, right, it feels like a descent because he has to go down to the root of the human heart and deal with all that icky, crud that's down there. But in the grand scheme of things, the descent is part of the ascent. It's always going in the same direction. It's always going up, even if for a while it feels like you're going hopelessly low. And so, yes, I love what Jonathan said earlier. Yes, it is indeed, the great story of a hero. It's Gilgamesh, it's Odysseus, it's Aeneas come back from the dead. But then it has this sort of element of Christian interiority and Christian depth, which probably got to Dante through long streams, which I won't bore everyone with, but through Plotinus and Augustine and Boethius, that deep Neoplatonic strand. And that's how it got into Dante and allowed him to create a poem of verticality, such as maybe the world hadn't seen.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's amazing insight. I think you're absolutely right. That is the difference between the Christian hero's journey, you could say, and the antique one, and that it also layers all of these together, because there's a cosmic element to Dante for sure, no doubt about it. There's this, because he is encountering all these historical figures, he's encountering all these characters, so there is this sense in which he's tracing for us a cosmos, and a cosmos that's ordered by the good, or by goodness, in the sense of it's the virtues or the vices of people that are actually constitute the shape of the cosmos, which is amazing. And their monsters are all there, but like you said, in some way, it's also an inner journey. And I think it's funny because I wonder what you think, because I was asked this recently by someone, which is that the characters in the ancient world, they don't necessarily have what we call character arcs today. Like they you can kind of find it if you look really hard, but you don't necessarily have the same kind of character arc that we expect out of fiction in the modern world. And I'm wondering if Dante is not a key figure in this type of transformation, inner transformation of the person, which follows the narrative. And then there's a kind of coherence in the external, let's say, external conclusion of the narrative of the story, but that it coincides with an internal transformation of the character as well. Like that is
Yeah.
not just like where it's not just you go out, you get the boon, you get it back. It's like you become something different and you sow it in the story, or you become something different.
Yeah, the Jason before Colchis and the Jason after the Golden Fleece is essentially the same dude, right?
It's the same guy.
I mean, I think my feeling is that in antiquity, I think you're right. I don't think there's the same type of character arc. Maybe you could call like a sort of a discovery of the secret name. And I'm borrowing a little bit from Gregory Nage on this one, but if you think of someone like Achilles, right? Achilles begins with an anger problem, right? But he doesn't really discover how angry he is until he's been snubbed. And my read, of course, Achilles is sort of ordinary soldier anger, what the Greeks call kolos, metastasizes into manus, which is a divine-like anger, when he begins to discover the full sort of like robbery that's happened to him, right? Of that his mother's been married off to a mortal, and thus in some sense his divine inheritance has been denied to him. And then this punk Agamemnon comes along and offers him a bunch of tripods, right? And women from Lesbos, that's not a sort of satisfactory compensation for for losing eternity. And thus then Achilles becomes the Laos. He becomes the Akos for the Laos. He becomes Achilleos. That is, he becomes the bane and the grief of people, but he also becomes the woundedness of being human. And thus part of the magic of the Iliad is that Achilles discovers his name. His sort of like ethical, spiritual, aesthetic DNA has been sleeping in him. And then in a moment of sort of discovery, the background logic begins to work in the foreground. I think
Mm,
in something like Dante, maybe this is the Christian aspect, maybe this is the Aristotelian aspect, that Dante seems to think that we have all these different faculties. And Jonathan has already pushed us way into the Paradiso, right? All these different astrological planets have their spiritual qualities, which Lewis, of course, tried to capture and so wonderfully in that hideous strength, right? There are always these different spiritual qualities, some of which we're more naturally in tune with because of our dispositions. But in some sense, what we have to do is retune the soul and get all of the strings of those spiritual qualities back into tune so that we actually sound good when we're plucked. And that's in some sense the human journey, but it's more complicated because it takes we have to learn from different people. But I think in Dante, there's something even more interesting. There's a kind of vulnerability that ultimately I can't achieve it all. Ultimately, I can't have perfectly
mm,
realized in myself every possible spiritual virtue. And thus, I need the Marcuses and the Jonathans of the world to actually, complement my own Jasonness, right? And thus, I think Dante has sort of a political vision in which these individual melodic lines do not find their fullness until they've been woven into the polyphonic hymn of reality.
mm.
Um, but I think it's both more complex, it's more vulnerable, it's more political in the sense of Dante's sort of more aware of the placidness of the human being. But I think that also provides a much more kind of dynamism of growth and changing character, like you suggested.
Yeah, and what you're saying makes me also realize to what extent Dante is always needs to be guided, because he goes through the whole process, and
Mm,
reaches the divine vision, but he never does it alone. He never also does it out of his own strength. There's a sense in which he is constantly trusting on these guides that become more and more lofty as he approaches. And so
hmm.
there's both the heroic journey, but also this sense of the love, right? Because I forget where it is in Purgatory at some point, it's kind of traced to him how it happened, right? It's like, the Virgin, she's not named, but it's like this, the Heavenly Virgin calls on his patron saint,
Oh
what is
yeah,
it,
this is
Saint
Inferno
Lucia,
too.
and then Saint
Yeah,
Lucia calls on Beatrice,
yeah,
and then Beatrice, and so this beautiful procession of love that comes from
that's right.
above that's kind of pulling him through the process,
Yes,
and so
it's
it's a
human beings imitating the angelic hierarchy as described by the Byzantine theologian Dionysius the Areopagite, right? Is that we have this sort of cascades of loves, right, in which we draw each other up. Yeah,
yeah, it's beautiful.
of
I mean,
course,
and it
until the
makes
final
gives it
vision.
yeah, and it gives it. So I think that that's probably in some ways uh what it is like this care. I'm curious too. Like, I mean, we're totally off subject here, but just because it's something that's been thinking about, like, because I've been thinking about this idea of the character arc as a figure in modern storytelling, and it seems that maybe there's something in Augustine as well in terms of his Confessions, where he basically does that, like he tells us the story of his own journey. So I don't know if you have seen that this might be also a trace in Dante, that there's something about the Confessions and that
Mm,
Dante going through that, it's not as confessional as the Confessions, like in the sense that
right,
Dante,
right.
there's an externality, it seems, to what he encounters. Like he doesn't necessarily, he talks about his sins very subtly, not that much.
Mhm.
Like at some point,
He's
he suggests that,
prideful and a little lustful,
yeah,
at
he's like, I'm going
least.
to spend some time here when he's in
Right. Yeah.
purgatory. He's like going to spend a lot of
Yeah.
time here. But it's not as much as, let's say, what you would see in the Confessions. Like he's meeting
Right.
these characters that are
Right.
manifesting it to him. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love your instincts. I mean, my read of the Confessions, and I'm just thinking of that wonderful imagery, and I think this is what does indeed get into Dante. I mean, so we know for sure that in whatever capacity he's encountered the Confessions, because Dante mentions it by name in his in one of his earlier works, in the banquet, in the Convivio, and he says that he didn't really want to talk a whole lot about himself. He doesn't want to use the first person singular, but Boethius in the Consolation and Gus in the Confessions did it, so I guess I will too.
Mhm.
And so he sort of ties his own kind of spiritual project to those two books, and that kind of influences how I wrote my introduction and how I read the poem. But my read in that with Augustine is that part of the magic And the reason he has to go all the way back to infancy and spend so much time contemplating infancy and how he learned language and so forth is that he has to use all the tools of his rational adult intellect. Trained in words, he's a rhetorician, of course. He has an elite chaired college position, right? He's a professor of rhetoric. He has to use all of those things in order to rediscover his inner pre-linguistic infant. And he has to hold on to those goods at once. His adult, male, rational intellect, his rationality, but then he also has to discover this whispering voice, which he himself uses this incredible feminine metaphor that is like a baby nursing at its mother's breast. And so, in my mind, the sort of part of the story of Augustine is that his use of this rationality to discover his inner infant, and I think that's exactly what happens in the comedy. And in fact, infant metaphors of suckling return at the very, very end of Paradiso. And that seemingly is what Dante prefers to describe his final vision. What was it like, Dante? He says it was like a baby that had woken up late and desperately wanted to nurse. And it sort of closes his eyes and falls asleep. So ultimately for Dante, I think there's this incredible thing. He has his hero's journey. He uses his rationality to the extreme, right? He discovers all these moral distinctions in all these people, but in the end, he is made to go before God. And he sees this kind of, these rings and this kind of black hole. And out of this black hole emerges the face of Christ, the Mendelian icon itself. And Dante has to let himself be looked at. And so for the male masculine poet who spent the totality of his life trying to use words to describe things, now he has to let himself become the beloved and be seen and all the sort of spiritual nakedness and fragility of his self. And that's, from my mind, there's this incredible kind of feminine conclusion to this great sort of heroic masculine journey. And these pieces, thanks to Beatrice, thanks to Virgil, right, thanks to Bernard, these fragmented pieces of his humanity are sort of reunited in the final vision. I'm glad you guys dragged me out of hell. I just wanted to talk about
you just want to talk about hell. Well, it's also because how can I say this? I think that we all kind of understand hell more easily, but I think that
in election years it's particularly easy too. Yeah, at least if you're where we're from.
Yeah, exactly. But in what you're describing, I think that's beautiful, because also I am always trying to figure out what's the difference between a Christian story and a pagan story, or what
is the difference?
Yeah, but I think we're capturing it here. This transformational aspect. Also, like you said, what's amazing about Dante is that when he reaches that final moment, he's not going. It's in his submission, right? It's not an active moving into God. I haven't read Paradiso in 10 years, but what I remember is that there's there are these like strands or something that like comes and basically takes him. Like he doesn't move into the divine vision. That he's kind of being. He's being brought into it,
he has to have external light come and fill his soul.
Yeah.
Which then causes his heart to irradiate more joy, which then increases the strength of his eyes so he's able to see more deeply. But in other words, he has to learn to love small things before he can love the greatest thing, right? Yeah. And so the light of the community has to come in him to give him the very capacity to love the source.
Yeah, and I think that's Christianity. Like, that's what it is. And that's, in some ways, I think that's what we're trying to do. I think that's the whole project. I think that's what C.S. Lewis is trying to do. I think the whole project is to be able to help people understand that true Christianity is this fractal thing, right?
Yes.
That the things, everything is good if they're loved at their proper level. And that if you love things in their proper measure, then they actually become a prism for God, and they lead you up ultimately into closer and closer to the divine vision. But it's not, so there is an ascetic aspect, and you see that in the poem as well, that there is an ascetic aspect. But even in the asceticism, even like if you read St. Gregory of Nyssa, if you read St. Maximus, you read these, St. Gregory of Nyssa is powerful because it's very ascetic, right? It's like you have to remove the garments of skin, you basically let go. But when Moses gets into the divine vision, then God gives him the tabernacle, Like he gives him this vision of the temple, and it's like, how when you realize, no, he's getting it all back. Everything that he kind of removed, he's receiving it in its proper place, in its proper measure, within like a pattern, an ordered pattern of revelation. And I think that that's it. Like that's really, in some ways, what we're trying to help people experience and see, because we have a kind of Christianity, we've had a kind of Christianity that has been in many ways moralistic and arbitrary, right? It's like, either you do all these good things so you can go to heaven, whatever that means, or you can't do anything good enough to go to heaven. So just like believe in Jesus, and when you die, you'll go to heaven. It's like, no, that's not the vision, right? The vision is this city that is full of the glory of God, and that's what I think that Dante, for me at least, he's helped me understand that. Like that the whole speech that Virgil gives him about, or no, I think it's Beatrice that gives him about the motion of the good, right? This movement into the good, and exactly what it is that you mentioned just now. For me, at least, was a great it was a great moment of revelation for me, and it helped me see clearly, because you can read it in theory, but seeing it in a poem makes you realize that, yeah, that's what C.S. Lewis is trying to show us, in The Great Divorce, for example. Like it's like
Yeah.
these are the images that he's trying to bring forward to us. So
Well, you've said it. And I say that the purpose of the sharpness of the poem is, one, that ethical aspect of trying to wake up people in a sleeping world. But two, and I think this is what you're getting into, for me, the more exciting thing, the metaphysical or the cosmological element, is that the world is an icon. And there are these medieval writers, it goes all the way back to late antiquity, who say that anything viewed rightly can be viewed as a name of God. That is at least, as you said, sort of a fractal, prismatic aspect of the divine. I'm just hoping, if it's okay, Marcus, can I read just a brief section to describe? And I say, to do all this, Dante needed the whole, this is from the introduction, Dante needed the whole set of notes on the keyboard of language, because he had plans to present God's world from top to bottom. This is Jonathan's point here. Medieval theologians taught that even the rocks and the dirt and worms bear some likeness to God. And sometimes, says Dionysius the Areopagite, low things are even better icons for God than high things, like light, because we're tempted to think of light as lofty, forgetting that even it infinitely fails to represent adequately divine beauty. What is more, Dante portrays sinners who want to wrest from God his world, and they rip at it and they pull it from his hands. But then even those fragmented bits, those pieces left over from their broken lives, are, against all expectation, miraculously woven back into the great tapestry of creation that figures forth God's power, justice, and benignity. God is near to his broken and miserable people, even in hell. God is near to his broken and miserable people, even if they won't or can't acknowledge his secret and invisible presence. And that thus, in my mind, Dante's hell has its own individual uses. It's kind of therapeutic. It's awakening, right? It's a bucket of cold water in the face. But viewed as Jonathan has been trying to make us do along the full ladder of the cosmos of creation, we get all those types of representations, all those fractals, all those fragmented and prismatic points of view. And thus, as a whole, Dante's poem is the most complete icon that had been rendered to date.
Yeah, it's possibly so. I think so. There's this little moment for me, like even in Limbo, when you see the scholars at the end of the poem, at the end of the canto. And sorry if I'm bad at remembering like the actual, like the details.
No, it's a fun exercise. I'll try to give you chapter and verse.
Yeah, exactly. Give me that in Dante. I can't even do it in the Bible, so imagine like doing it with Dante. This moment, like where they kind of come together, in their little, I think they're in the city, and there's like a little hill, like there's kind of like this little, and they go up, and then they have some light. Like it's weird because it's like they're not supposed to be light there, but they kind of have this like little moment of light. And when when I was reading, I was like,
I think
this
you're
like
thinking Inferno 4, yeah, with the noble
there's like
pagans.
a little microcosm of the whole poem that it's being brought into hell, basically.
Even here.
Yeah,
even
yeah. And I was like,
miserable
this
and
is
broken and the
this is
wretched,
wild to me. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. Even here, there's, yeah. And then, of course, all those folks down there, I jokingly say to my students, these are the Pulitzer Prize winners, the Nobel Prize winners, right? These are the chaired professors at Harvard. These are the people who mattered, right? And thus, Virgil says something, their only punishment is the loss of the good of the intellect. But these are people whose hearts are so hungry for the real and the deep and the true that only in this sense means merely or purely, right? Unless they feel it really acutely. So,
Mm.
yeah, even the warmth of their own light, they feel it to be insufficient in light of what they could have had. Yeah.
Mm.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, gents. I know you have to go now, unfortunately, this evening, Jason, but I most appreciate both your times. And that was a wonderful conversation. Wonderful to be able to listen to you, gents, speak so eloquently and to share your love for these great works of literature and so on. And I hope others are edified by this. And God willing, we could do it again sometime, either online or in person. That would be a real joy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks,
St.
Marcus.
Patrick's
It's always
Purgatory.
great. We'll go to St. Patrick's for we have to go. I have to go, sure. Like especially Marcus is there. Like I'll go to I didn't even know about it until Richard Rowland told me about it. We did a video on Purgatory, and then he was telling me about this place, and then Marcus says, I live there. And I'm like, what? Like you're there? That's wild. So yeah, so we have to go for sure.
Yeah. And I'll read some Conti from the new translation.
Wouldn't that be amazing? That'd be amazing.
God willing. Thank you,
Thanks,
gents.
Marcus.